Remember those meatloaf dishes from the 1950s? The kind only grandma knew how to make just right? Each one had its own twist, tucked into handwritten notes and splattered cookbook pages. These 30 forgotten meatloaf recipes were staples at the dinner table. Let's take a look back at the flavors that fed a generation. Classic meatloaf with brown gravy. There's something undeniably comforting about a classic meatloaf. If you close your eyes, you can almost smell the warm aroma drifting from the oven. Rich, savory, and just the right amount of caramelized goodness. This meatloaf isn't fancy, and that's what makes it perfect. It's the kind of dish that shows up week after week, effortlessly filling the house with the scent of home. In the 1950s, when people were looking for dependable, hearty meals after a long day, this was it. The beauty of this dish lies in its simplicity. Ground beef, breadcrumbs, and eggs form the foundation of this comforting loaf. But it's the brown gravy that takes it from good to unforgettable. The gravy adds a luscious, velvety finish that perfectly complements the savory meatloaf, elevating the entire meal with just a few ingredients. It's the type of dish that not only satisfies hunger, but also fills you with that warm, nostalgic feeling of being at your grandmother's table. To make this classic meatloaf, start with about a pound of ground beef, preferably 80% lean for the perfect balance of flavor and juiciness. In a large bowl, mix the beef with a cup of breadcrumbs, an egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce for that subtle depth of flavor. Then, carefully shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a baking dish. While the meatloaf is baking, take a few minutes to prepare the brown gravy. In a saucepan, melt a bit of butter, then stir in some flour to create a roux. Gradually add beef broth, whisking constantly to keep things smooth. Season with a pinch of salt, pepper, and a splash of soy sauce for a rich umami punch. Once the meatloaf is baked to a golden brown perfection, pour the homemade brown gravy over the top, letting it soak in and enhance every bite. Serve this classic meatloaf with mashed potatoes or a side of vegetables for the ultimate comfort meal. It's a dish that never goes out of style. Meatloaf with ketchup and mustard topping. When you think of a meatloaf from the 1950s, it's hard not to picture that glossy, sweet and tangy topping, ketchup, with just enough mustard to cut through the richness. This topping became the hallmark of mid-century comfort food, transforming a simple loaf of ground beef into something special. It wasn't just about taste, it was about presentation too, with that vibrant red glaze giving the meatloaf a picture-perfect finish. Grandma knew that a well-dressed meatloaf could brighten even the dreariest of dinners. The secret to this dish lies in its perfect balance of flavors. The sweetness of the ketchup, paired with the sharpness of the mustard, creates a zesty layer that contrasts beautifully with the savory meat inside. Every bite is a perfect harmony of tang and richness, making it a true crowd pleaser. To start, gather a pound of ground beef, typically an 80-20 blend for optimal moisture. Mix the beef with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a bit of Worcestershire sauce to deepen the flavor. Then, form the mixture into a loaf shape and place it in a baking dish. The beauty of this meatloaf is in its simplicity, but the real magic happens when you prepare the glaze. In a small bowl, combine about half a cup of ketchup with 2 tablespoons of yellow mustard. Add a tablespoon of brown sugar for a touch of sweetness, and stir until it's all perfectly blended. Once your meatloaf is about halfway cooked, take it out of the oven and spread the ketchup mustard glaze generously over the top. Pop it back in the oven and bake until the glaze is bubbling and caramelized, creating a beautiful sheen that makes the meatloaf irresistible. This meatloaf is best served with mashed potatoes or steamed vegetables, making it the ultimate retro comfort dish. The sweet and tangy topping is a throwback to a time when meals didn't need to be fancy to be perfect. It's simple, satisfying, and has just the right amount of nostalgia in every bite. Bacon-wrapped meatloaf. When it comes to elevating a classic dish, there's really no better way than by adding bacon. And that's exactly what makes this 1950s meatloaf so special. Wrapped in crispy, sizzling bacon, this meatloaf takes on a whole new level of flavor and texture. The smoky, savory goodness of the bacon mingles with the hearty beef, creating a mouth-watering combination that's both indulgent and satisfying. This was the type of dish that made guests feel like they were treated to something extra special, even if it was just a weeknight dinner. Bacon had a way of making everything feel luxurious in the 1950s. It was a symbol of indulgence, something that could turn even the most basic meal into a decadent feast. For this meatloaf, the bacon not only adds a rich flavor, but also helps to keep the meatloaf moist, ensuring each slice is tender and juicy. To make this bacon-wrapped meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20, for the perfect balance of fat and flavor. In a large bowl, mix the beef with a cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and a handful of finely chopped onions. Add salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce to enhance the savory taste. Once everything is combined, form the mixture into a loaf shape. Now here's where the magic happens. Take about 8 to 10 slices of bacon and carefully wrap them around the meatloaf. Overlap the bacon slightly to ensure it covers the entire surface of the loaf. Tuck the ends underneath the meatloaf so the bacon stays in place while it cooks. If you want a little extra flavor, you can brush the bacon with a mixture of maple syrup and Dijon mustard for a sweet and tangy glaze. Place the bacon-wrapped meatloaf in a baking dish and bake at 375 degrees for about 50 to 60 minutes, or until the bacon is crispy and the meatloaf is cooked through. The bacon will crisp up beautifully, and the fat will render into the meatloaf, giving it an unbeatable richness. Serve this bacon-wrapped meatloaf with your favorite sides: mashed potatoes, green beans, or even a simple salad. Every bite is a perfect balance of smoky, savory, and tender meat, making it an unforgettable family favorite. Meatloaf with mushroom soup sauce. There's a certain kind of comfort that comes with the creamy, savory goodness of mushroom soup. In the 1950s, this canned kitchen staple was a go-to ingredient, making everything from casseroles to sauces easier, richer, and more flavorful. For meatloaf, it was a match made in heaven. The mushroom soup sauce added a velvety smoothness that complemented the dense, hearty meatloaf, transforming it into a luxurious, comforting meal that felt both homey and indulgent. This dish is a true reflection of the 1950s love for simplicity and convenience. Using a can of mushroom soup wasn't just about ease, it was about creating a sauce that could elevate a basic dish like meatloaf into something extraordinary. The creaminess of the soup, combined with a touch of seasoning, melts into the meatloaf during baking, keeping it moist and adding a depth of flavor that is irresistible. To begin, take 1 pound of ground beef, usually 80-20 for a juicy, flavorful loaf, and place it in a large mixing bowl. Add a cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and a finely chopped onion. Season the mixture with salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce. Gently mix everything together until just combined. Overmixing can make the meatloaf dense, so go easy on the stirring. Once everything is incorporated, shape the mixture into a loaf and transfer it to a baking dish. Now, for the star of the show, the mushroom soup sauce. In a separate bowl, combine 1 can of condensed cream of mushroom soup with a bit of milk to thin it out, creating a smooth, pourable sauce. Add a pinch of salt, pepper, and a bit of garlic powder for extra flavor. Pour this creamy sauce over the meatloaf, covering it generously. The sauce will bake into the meatloaf, adding moisture and a rich, comforting taste that sticks with you long after the meal is over. Bake the meatloaf in a preheated oven at 350 degrees Celsius for about 60 minutes or until the meatloaf is cooked through. The mushroom soup sauce will bubble and thicken, creating a velvety coating that perfectly complements the hearty meat. This dish is best served with mashed potatoes or roasted vegetables, as the rich sauce is just begging to be sopped up with a slice of warm, buttery bread. Meatloaf with mushroom soup sauce is the epitome of mid-century comfort food, offering simple ingredients that come together to create something truly special. Sweet and sour meatloaf. In the 1950s, the combination of sweet and sour was all the rage. It was the flavor profile that brightened up everything from meatballs to salads, and it gave even the humblest of dishes a zesty twist. Sweet and sour meatloaf became a beloved classic, with its tangy glaze and savory interior offering the perfect contrast. It wasn't just dinner. It was a celebration of bold flavors coming together in harmony, creating a dish that was as comforting as it was exciting. The sweet and sour combination was, and still is, the ultimate crowd pleaser. The sweetness, often from brown sugar or pineapple, is balanced beautifully with the tanginess of vinegar or ketchup. This flavorful glaze coats the meatloaf like a vibrant blanket, infusing each bite with a balance of flavors that make this dish irresistible. To make sweet and sour meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, choosing an 80-20 blend for its juiciness and flavor. In a mixing bowl, combine the beef with a cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce to enhance the savory notes of the meat. Mix everything gently until it's just combined. Overworking the meat will result in a dense loaf, and that's not what we want. Form the mixture into a loaf and place it in a baking dish. Now for the sweet and sour glaze, combine half a cup of brown sugar, a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar, and a couple of tablespoons of ketchup in a small bowl. Stir it until the sugar dissolves, and then pour the glaze generously over the meatloaf, making sure it's evenly covered. As it bakes, the glaze caramelizes, forming a sweet, tangy crust that makes every bite burst with flavor. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's fully cooked and golden on top. As it bakes, the sweet and sour glaze will thicken, creating a glossy finish that will make everyone at the table eager for the first slice. This meatloaf is perfect when served with mashed potatoes or rice, something to soak up that delicious, tangy sauce. Sweet and sour meatloaf takes the familiar comfort of a classic dish and adds just the right amount of excitement, making it a timeless favorite for every family meal. Meatloaf with hard-boiled eggs inside. If you've ever wondered what makes a meatloaf stand out from the crowd, this dish is the answer. Meatloaf with hard-boiled eggs inside may sound unusual, but it was a beloved twist on the classic, a recipe that turned a simple loaf of meat into a delightful surprise. Picture slicing into the meatloaf to reveal a perfectly boiled egg nestled inside, adding an extra layer of richness and flavor to each bite. This dish was one of those wow meals that Grandma served when she really wanted to impress the family. It's both practical and clever, transforming everyday ingredients into something special. This 1950s recipe became a favorite because it not only added a unique texture to the meatloaf, but the eggs also acted as a clever filler, making the dish feel more substantial. The hard-boiled eggs give the meatloaf a creamy, delicate center, contrasting beautifully with the savory, hearty exterior. It's a dish that holds a bit of nostalgia, reminding us of a time when families made the most of simple ingredients, creating something extraordinary out of everyday staples. To start, take 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for its balance of flavor and moisture. In a large mixing bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce for depth of flavor. Once everything is well mixed, divide the mixture in half. Now here's the fun part. Carefully peel 4 hard-boiled eggs and nestle them in the center of the first half of the meat mixture. Once the eggs are in place, gently fold the remaining half of the meat mixture over the eggs, covering them completely. Shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a baking dish. To add even more flavor, some cooks would top this meatloaf with a tangy ketchup glaze or a layer of brown gravy, but it's perfectly delicious on its own. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's cooked through and golden brown on top. When you slice into the loaf, the hard-boiled eggs will create an exciting surprise in the middle, making every serving just a little more indulgent. Serve this meatloaf with mashed potatoes or a vegetable side, and you've got a nostalgic dish that's both simple and impressive. Meatloaf with sweet potato. In the 1950s, sweet potatoes were more than just a holiday side dish. They were a wholesome, hearty ingredient that made their way into all sorts of meals, including the beloved meatloaf. This particular version takes the classic comfort food and gives it a slightly sweeter, more earthy twist by incorporating mashed sweet potatoes into the meat mixture. The sweet potato not only adds a bit of natural sweetness, but also a velvety texture that keeps the meatloaf moist and tender. It's a delightful combination that combines the savory richness of the beef with the smooth, sweet goodness of the potatoes. The addition of sweet potato is a testament to the era's love of versatility in the kitchen. It was a time when home cooks sought ways to stretch ingredients and create meals that were both nutritious and satisfying. Sweet potatoes were affordable, packed with vitamins, and could be paired with everything from meats to marshmallows. In meatloaf, they not only make the dish more filling, but also add an unexpected layer of flavor, blending seamlessly with the other ingredients. To start, take 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for the right balance of flavor and fat. In a large bowl, mix the ground beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and half a cup of finely chopped onion. Add salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce to season the mixture. The star of the show, mashed sweet potatoes, should be prepared ahead of time. Boil or bake about 2 medium sweet potatoes, then mash them until smooth. About a cup of mashed sweet potato will be perfect for this recipe. Gently fold the mashed sweet potato into the beef mixture, ensuring it's evenly incorporated. The natural sweetness of the potato will balance out the richness of the beef, making every bite a perfect blend of savory and sweet. Once mixed, form the mixture into a loaf shape and place it in a baking dish. For a little extra flavor, some cooks would drizzle the top with a bit of melted butter or a sprinkle of brown sugar, letting it caramelize during baking. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until the meatloaf is fully cooked and golden brown on top. When it's ready, slice into this sweet and savory meatloaf, revealing a tender, flavorful interior with just the right hint of sweetness. Serve with mashed potatoes or green beans to complement the dish. Meatloaf with sweet potato offers a delightful twist on a beloved classic, adding richness and comfort with every bite. Meatloaf with cheese filling. There's no denying it. Cheese makes everything better. And in the 1950s, the addition of cheese to meatloaf was nothing short of a revelation. Imagine cutting into a beautifully baked loaf, only to discover that it hides a creamy, melty center of cheese. This was the type of surprise that could take a humble dish and turn it into something special. Whether it was cheddar, mozzarella, or a blend of both, the cheese filling was a simple yet indulgent twist that elevated the meatloaf to new heights. It's a dish that feels like a cozy embrace, with every bite revealing a gooey, savory heart. In the 1950s, cheese was quickly becoming a star ingredient, used not only in sandwiches and casseroles, but also to enhance the flavor and texture of meatloaf. The melty cheese creates a luscious contrast with the meaty exterior, adding a rich and comforting dimension. What makes this cheese-filled meatloaf even more delightful is the surprise factor. No one expects that cheesy center, and when they find it, it's always a pleasant, satisfying treat. To start, use 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20, for its perfect balance of fat and flavor. In a mixing bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce to round out the flavor. Mix everything gently, being careful not to overwork the meat to keep it tender. Once your meat mixture is ready, divide it in half. Take a block of cheese. Cheddar is a classic choice, but mozzarella or a blend of the two works beautifully, and cut it into small cubes or use pre-shredded cheese. Lay the cheese cubes down the center of 1/2 of the meat mixture, creating a nice layer. Then, gently place the other half of the meat mixture on top, sealing the edges to keep the cheese inside. Shape the entire thing into a loaf and place it in a baking dish. For extra flavor, some cooks like to top this meatloaf with a tangy ketchup or barbecue sauce glaze. But it's not necessary if you prefer to let the cheese shine on its own. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes or until it's fully cooked and golden brown on top. When you slice into this meatloaf, you'll be greeted with a warm, gooey center of cheese that melts beautifully into the savory meat. Serve this cheesy meatloaf with mashed potatoes or a green vegetable for a complete, comforting meal. It's a delightful variation of the classic, one that combines the richness of cheese with the heartiness of meatloaf in a way that's both surprising and utterly satisfying. Meatloaf with tomato sauce. If there's one thing that can instantly transport you back to a 1950s kitchen, it's the sight of a meatloaf topped with a glossy, vibrant tomato sauce. This is the version that many of us grew up with. The familiar, comforting meal that combines the savory goodness of ground beef with the tangy sweetness of tomato sauce. It's simple, satisfying, and always hits the spot. The beauty of this dish lies in its uncomplicated ingredients, yet it's still packed with flavor that makes every bite feel like a homecoming. Tomato sauce on meatloaf was the go-to topping in many households during the 1950s. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about making the dish look appealing too. That rich red glaze that caramelizes slightly during baking gave the meatloaf an inviting, appetizing finish. The sweet, slightly acidic flavor of the tomato sauce pairs perfectly with the savory, umami-rich meat, creating a balanced, comforting meal that became a staple in homes across the country. To make this classic version of meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for the best texture and flavor. In a large mixing bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season generously with salt and pepper, and add a couple of dashes of Worcestershire sauce for that signature savory kick. Mix the ingredients gently until just combined. Overworking the meat can result in a dense loaf, so keep it light and airy. Once your meat mixture is ready, form it into a loaf shape and place it in a baking dish. Now, for the all-important tomato sauce topping. In a small bowl, combine about 1 cup of tomato sauce with a tablespoon of brown sugar and a teaspoon of vinegar. Stir it until the sugar dissolves, and then pour the mixture evenly over the top of the meatloaf, ensuring every inch is coated. Bake the meatloaf in a preheated oven at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's cooked through and the tomato sauce has thickened and caramelized slightly. The result is a glossy, rich glaze that clings to the meatloaf, enhancing every bite with its sweet and tangy flavor. Serve this tomato-sauced meatloaf with mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables, or a simple green salad. The comforting, familiar flavors of this dish make it a timeless classic, reminding us of simpler times when a well-prepared meal didn't need to be fancy to be deeply satisfying. This meatloaf with tomato sauce is the kind of recipe that sticks with you, filling your heart and stomach with that unmistakable feeling of home. Meatloaf with onion soup mix. In the 1950s, convenience was key. And what better way to make a dish both flavorful and simple than by using a packet of onion soup mix? This clever shortcut became a pantry staple for many home cooks, turning basic dishes like meatloaf into a savory, aromatic masterpiece. The onion soup mix isn't just a seasoning, it's the secret ingredient that takes this meatloaf from ordinary to extraordinary, infusing the meat with a deep, savory richness that's irresistible. This recipe embraces the mid-century love of using packaged goods to save time while still delivering a hearty, flavorful meal. The onion soup mix adds a wonderful depth of flavor, imparting a savory, almost smoky taste to the meatloaf. It's a perfect balance of ease and flavor, something that was both practical and delicious in an era when families wanted a meal that could be on the table quickly without compromising on taste. To start, you'll need 1 pound of ground beef, typically an 80-20 blend for the best mix of juiciness and flavor. In a large mixing bowl, combine the ground beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and 1 packet of onion soup mix. The onion soup mix does all the work for you, with its blend of dehydrated onions, seasonings, and flavor enhancers. Add a little salt and pepper to taste, but the soup mix already packs a lot of seasoning, so go easy. Mix everything together gently to avoid overworking the meat, which can make it tough. Once your mixture is ready, shape it into a loaf and place it in a baking dish. The beauty of this meatloaf is in its simplicity, but if you'd like to kick it up a notch, you can add a drizzle of ketchup or BBQ sauce on top before baking, giving it a nice, tangy finish. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's fully cooked and golden brown. The result is a meatloaf that's perfectly seasoned with the savory goodness of onion soup, with a rich, moist interior that's full of flavor. The onion soup mix works its magic, creating a subtle, comforting taste that everyone will love. Serve this hearty meatloaf with mashed potatoes or a green vegetable, and you've got a meal that's both simple and satisfying. Meatloaf with onion soup mix is the perfect example of 1950s ingenuity, turning a few basic ingredients into something unforgettable. It's a timeless, comforting dish that proves the power of a well-seasoned, easy-to-make meal. Meatloaf with barbecue sauce. In the 1950s, barbecue sauce wasn't just for grilling. Home cooks were slathering it on everything, including meatloaf. This version combines the classic comfort of meatloaf with the smoky, tangy sweetness of barbecue sauce, creating a dish that's both familiar and exciting. The rich flavors of the beef are enhanced by the barbecue sauce, giving the meatloaf a bold, zesty finish. It's the kind of dish that can turn a simple family meal into something special with minimal effort. Barbecue sauce was gaining popularity in the 1950s, thanks in part to the growing influence of regional barbecue styles and the rise of convenience foods. In many homes, a bottle of barbecue sauce was a pantry essential, ready to elevate a quick dinner into something with layers of flavor. Whether it was a smoky, sweet, or tangy sauce, it was the perfect match for meatloaf, offering a delicious contrast to the savory meat and binding everything together in a mouth-watering glaze. To make this dish, start with 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20, for that perfect balance of flavor and juiciness. In a large bowl, combine the ground beef with a cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Add salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce for a touch of depth. Gently mix the ingredients together, being careful not to overwork the meat, which can lead to a tough loaf. Once the meat mixture is ready, shape it into a loaf and place it in a baking dish. Now comes the best part, the barbecue sauce. In a small bowl, combine about half a cup of your favorite barbecue sauce with a tablespoon of brown sugar and a teaspoon of apple cider vinegar to balance the sweetness and acidity. Mix it well and pour it generously over the top of the meatloaf, making sure it's completely covered. If you like your meatloaf extra saucy, feel free to add more sauce to the top during the last few minutes of baking. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's cooked through and the barbecue sauce is bubbling and caramelized. The sauce will form a beautiful glaze, adding a smoky, tangy layer of flavor to the already savory meatloaf. Serve this barbecue meatloaf with mashed potatoes, coleslaw, or roasted vegetables for the ultimate comfort meal. The smoky sweetness of the barbecue sauce paired with the hearty, tender meatloaf is a match made in culinary heaven. It's a dish that has all the nostalgia of classic meatloaf with the exciting twist of barbecue goodness. Curry meatloaf. In the 1950s, bold, international flavors were beginning to make their way into the American kitchen, and curry was one of the exciting new additions. While curry may seem like an unexpected seasoning for meatloaf, this recipe brings an exotic twist to the classic dish, giving it a warm, aromatic depth that was a bit ahead of its time. The fragrant spices of curry blend beautifully with the savory beef, creating a meatloaf that's both comforting and full of character. This dish is proof that sometimes the best meals come from mixing the old with the new, offering a bit of adventure with each bite. The 1950s saw the rise of interest in flavors from India, the Middle East, and other parts of the world, and curry powder became an accessible way to incorporate these spices into everyday meals. While this might have been a bold choice for the era, it reflects the era's curiosity and excitement about exploring new tastes. Curry meatloaf became a favorite for those looking to add a little spice to their dinner routine, and it offered a delightful way to switch up the traditional meatloaf recipe without straying too far from the comforting, familiar flavors. To make this curry meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for the right balance of juiciness and flavor. In a mixing bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season the mixture with salt, pepper, and about 1 tablespoon of curry powder. The curry will add an aromatic warmth and depth of flavor, but be careful not to overdo it. The goal is to enhance the meat, not overwhelm it. You can also add a pinch of garlic powder, ginger, or turmeric for extra warmth. But curry powder will be the star here. Mix everything together gently, being sure not to overwork the meat. Once it's all well combined, shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a baking dish. Some cooks like to add a drizzle of tomato sauce or ketchup on top for a bit of sweetness, but this is optional. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's cooked through and golden brown on top. When it's ready, slice into this uniquely spiced meatloaf, revealing a fragrant, flavorful interior with just the right amount of kick from the curry. Serve with rice or a simple salad to balance the bold flavors. This curry meatloaf is a perfect example of how the 1950s embraced new flavors, making it a memorable twist on an old classic. It's hearty, comforting, and just the right amount of adventurous, an unforgettable dish that will spice up any dinner table. Meatloaf with rice. Sometimes, simplicity is all you need to make a meal feel just right, and that's exactly what this 1950s meatloaf with rice brings to the table. This version of meatloaf is hearty and filling, with rice mixed right into the meatloaf itself, creating a tender, textured interior that's both comforting and substantial. Rice was a common pantry staple in many households during the 1950s, offering a way to stretch meals and feed the whole family without breaking the budget. This clever addition turns meatloaf into a complete meal in itself, without the need for extra sides. In the 1950s, families were always looking for ways to save time and make meals go further. Adding rice to meatloaf wasn't just a way to stretch the dish, it also helped keep the meatloaf light and moist. The rice soaks up the juices from the beef and binds everything together, giving the loaf a delicate yet satisfying texture. It's the kind of dish that feels both hearty and homey, the sort of meal that makes you feel warm and satisfied after the first bite. To start, you'll need 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for its ideal fat content. In a large bowl, combine the ground beef with 1 cup of cooked rice, preferably white rice, though you could use brown for a more earthy flavor. Add 1 beaten egg, 1 small finely chopped onion, and about half a cup of breadcrumbs to bind everything together. Season generously with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce to bring depth to the flavors. The rice will not only add texture, but will also absorb the savory beef juices, making every bite moist and flavorful. Once your mixture is well combined, shape it into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For a little extra flavor, some people like to top their meatloaf with a bit of ketchup or tomato sauce before baking, creating a sweet and tangy glaze on top. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's golden brown on top and cooked through. When you slice into the meatloaf, you'll notice the tender grains of rice mingling perfectly with the beef, creating a satisfying texture that's both comforting and filling. Serve this meatloaf with a simple side of vegetables or a salad to round out the meal. Meatloaf with rice is the perfect example of how the 1950s took basic ingredients and turned them into something comforting and practical. It's a dish that's both easy to make and incredibly satisfying, a true classic that has stood the test of time. Meatloaf with veggies. In the 1950s, vegetables were often treated as an essential side dish. But what if you could incorporate them right into the meatloaf itself? That's exactly what this 1950s meatloaf with veggies does. Taking the classic dish and packing it full of colorful, nutritious vegetables. It's a meal that not only nourishes the body, but also brightens up the dinner table with a pop of color. This variation of meatloaf was a clever way to get kids to eat their vegetables without them even realizing it. Hidden inside the savory meatloaf, they provided a burst of flavor and texture. In an era when convenience and practicality were key, this veggie-packed meatloaf was a clever way to combine the meat and the side dish all in one, making dinner both easier and more nutritious. The vegetables soften as the meatloaf bakes, blending into the meat and infusing the dish with a sweetness that perfectly balances the savory beef. Whether it was peas, carrots, or green beans, adding vegetables to the meatloaf gave it a fuller, more rounded flavor, and it became a way for families to get a little extra nutrition in their meal without much fuss. To make this hearty meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for the best flavor and moisture. In a large mixing bowl, combine the ground beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce. The key here is to add your favorite vegetables, frozen peas and carrots, finely chopped green beans, or corn work beautifully. You'll want to use about a cup of mixed vegetables, making sure they are thawed and drained if they're frozen. These veggies will add flavor and texture, making the meatloaf even more satisfying. Once the mixture is combined, shape it into a loaf and transfer it to a baking dish. Some cooks like to drizzle the top with ketchup or tomato sauce to add a little tangy sweetness, but it's optional. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's cooked through and the top is golden brown. The vegetables will meld seamlessly into the meatloaf, creating a moist and flavorful loaf that's both hearty and healthy. Serve this veggie-filled meatloaf with mashed potatoes or a side of rice to round out the meal. It's a simple, satisfying dinner that incorporates vegetables in a way that feels effortless and delicious. Meatloaf with veggies is a timeless dish that brings together the warmth and comfort of the classic meatloaf with the added bonus of extra nutrition. Perfect for any family dinner table. Meatloaf with mustard glaze. If there's one thing that can take meatloaf to the next level, it's a tangy, zesty mustard glaze. In the 1950s, mustard was often used to add a little punch to dishes, and this meatloaf variation was no exception. The mustard glaze gives the loaf a sharp, savory contrast to the richness of the beef, creating a balance that's both comforting and exciting. It's the kind of meal that makes you feel like you're enjoying something familiar yet refreshingly different at the same time. This mustard-glazed meatloaf is a perfect example of how simple ingredients can create a dish full of bold flavors. The mustard glaze is the star of the show, offering a sharp, slightly tangy finish that complements the rich, savory beef. Whether you prefer yellow mustard for its bright tang or Dijon mustard for a more refined heat, the glaze provides the perfect amount of zest without overwhelming the dish. This meatloaf is ideal for those who appreciate the balance between savory and tangy, and it's a dish that brings a delightful burst of flavor to your dinner table. To make the meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for its juicy, flavorful texture. In a large mixing bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce to bring out the savory flavors. Mix the ingredients together gently, being careful not to overwork the meat. Once your mixture is well combined, shape it into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. Now, for the mustard glaze, combine about half a cup of yellow mustard with 2 tablespoons of honey or brown sugar. This will create a sweet, tangy glaze that's perfect for drizzling over the top of the meatloaf. Stir in a bit of vinegar or lemon juice for added acidity, and then pour the glaze generously over the loaf. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, basting it with the mustard glaze every 20 minutes to build up that glossy, flavorful coating. The glaze will caramelize slightly as it bakes, creating a tangy, sweet crust that enhances every bite. Once baked, serve the meatloaf with mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, or a simple salad to complement the tangy mustard flavor. This mustard-glazed meatloaf is a perfect blend of the familiar and the bold, creating a meal that feels timeless yet fresh. It's a great way to elevate a classic dish and introduce a little extra flavor without straying too far from tradition. Meatloaf with tomato and bacon. When you think of meatloaf, you probably think of a simple, savory dish, but the addition of tomato and bacon takes it to a whole new level. In the 1950s, bacon was a luxury ingredient that could instantly elevate any meal, and this meatloaf is no exception. The smoky richness of crispy bacon combines beautifully with the tangy, sweet notes of tomatoes, creating a flavor profile that's both familiar and indulgent. It's a comforting meal that feels both hearty and sophisticated, perfect for a family dinner or a gathering with friends. The tomato and bacon topping adds a delicious, savory contrast to the moist and tender beef inside. As the meatloaf bakes, the bacon crisps up, adding a satisfying crunch, while the tomatoes break down into a rich, flavorful sauce that seeps into the meat. It's a match made in culinary heaven, with the smokiness of the bacon complementing the freshness of the tomatoes. The result is a comforting yet indulgent twist on the traditional meatloaf that will make everyone at the table ask for seconds. To begin, start with 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20, for a juicy and flavorful base. In a large bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season generously with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce. Mix everything together gently, taking care not to overwork the meat. Once well combined, shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. Now for the toppings, take about 6 strips of bacon and fry them until they're crispy. Once cooked, crumble the bacon into small pieces. In a separate bowl, combine 1 cup of tomato sauce with a tablespoon of brown sugar, a teaspoon of vinegar, and a pinch of salt. This will create a sweet, tangy sauce to top the meatloaf. Pour the tomato sauce over the meatloaf, then sprinkle the crumbled bacon on top for a crunchy finish. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's cooked through and golden brown on top. The tomato sauce will thicken slightly as it bakes, while the bacon crisps up, giving the meatloaf an irresistible combination of textures and flavors. Serve this tomato and bacon meatloaf with mashed potatoes, green beans, or a side salad. The smoky bacon and tangy tomato sauce add an exciting twist to the classic meatloaf, making it feel like a special occasion meal, even on a weeknight. This dish is a perfect example of how simple ingredients, when combined thoughtfully, can turn an everyday meal into something extraordinary. Meatloaf with cream of celery soup. In the 1950s, canned soups became a pantry staple, making meals quicker and easier without sacrificing flavor. One of the most popular soups used in cooking was cream of celery, which added a rich, creamy texture and a mild, savory flavor to everything from casseroles to meatloaf. Meatloaf with cream of celery soup is a prime example of how convenience ingredients could be used to create a hearty, comforting meal that the whole family could enjoy. The result is a moist, flavorful meatloaf with a creamy, aromatic sauce that adds a touch of luxury without any extra effort. The beauty of using cream of celery soup in this meatloaf is that it not only enhances the flavor, but also keeps the meatloaf incredibly moist. The soup blends with the beef, infusing it with a velvety richness that you just can't achieve with a simple tomato or brown gravy topping. Plus, the soup helps bind the ingredients together, making the meatloaf a little lighter and fluffier. This dish is a perfect example of the 1950s philosophy, using the convenience of processed ingredients to create something truly delicious. To make this comforting meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for the best texture and flavor. In a large bowl, mix the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a couple of dashes of Worcestershire sauce for extra depth. Gently mix everything together to avoid overworking the meat. Next, fold in about half a can of cream of celery soup. This will not only give the meatloaf its signature creamy texture, but will also lend a subtle flavor that perfectly complements the beef. Shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For added flavor, some people like to top the meatloaf with a little more cream of celery soup or a sprinkle of Parmesan cheese before baking, but it's delicious even without. Bake the meatloaf at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes or until the top is golden and the meatloaf is cooked through. The soup will blend with the beef as it bakes, creating a rich, savory sauce that coats the meatloaf, making every bite melt in your mouth. Serve this creamy meatloaf with mashed potatoes, rice, or a side of steamed vegetables. The soup adds just the right amount of richness, making this version of meatloaf comforting, satisfying, and absolutely delicious. Meatloaf with cream of celery soup is a great example of how the 1950s turned convenience into comfort, creating a dish that's both timeless and effortlessly enjoyable. Meatloaf with cheddar and jalapeno. In the 1950s, bold and spicy flavors were just beginning to make their way into mainstream American cooking. While not as common as today, a touch of heat was starting to sneak into recipes, and this meatloaf with cheddar and jalapeno was a prime example. Combining the creamy sharpness of cheddar cheese with the heat of jalapenos, this version of meatloaf offered a delightful contrast to the traditional savory loaf, adding layers of flavor and a little bit of kick. It was a simple way to bring a little excitement to an otherwise classic, comforting dish. This meatloaf variation perfectly balances the creamy, salty richness of melted cheddar with the crisp, spicy bite of jalapenos. The cheese melts into the meat, making it extra moist and flavorful, while the jalapenos add just the right amount of heat. This dish is a great example of how a few ingredients can transform a humble meatloaf into something a bit more daring and exciting, while still maintaining all the comfort of the original. To make this zesty meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for the right amount of fat and flavor. In a large mixing bowl, combine the ground beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce to give it depth. Next, fold in 1 cup of shredded cheddar cheese and 1 or 2 finely chopped jalapenos, depending on how much heat you prefer. The cheese will melt into the meat as it cooks, creating a rich, gooey interior, while the jalapenos infuse the meat with a subtle, spicy kick. Make sure to remove the seeds from the jalapenos if you want to control the level of heat. Once everything is well mixed, shape the meat mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For a little extra cheese on top, you can sprinkle a bit more shredded cheddar over the meatloaf before baking. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until the meatloaf is cooked through and golden brown on top. The cheddar will bubble up beautifully, creating a cheesy crust that pairs perfectly with the spicy heat of the jalapenos. Serve this spicy meatloaf with a side of creamy mashed potatoes or a fresh salad to cool things down. The combination of cheddar and jalapeno gives this meatloaf a modern twist while still honoring the comforting, hearty nature of the classic dish. It's a flavorful, satisfying way to spice up a beloved family favorite. Meatloaf with green bell peppers. Green bell peppers, often overlooked in everyday cooking, made a regular appearance in 1950s kitchens, and their crisp, slightly bitter flavor paired perfectly with the savory richness of meatloaf. Meatloaf with green bell peppers is a nostalgic dish that brings a subtle sweetness and a crunchy texture to the mix, adding both color and flavor. It's a variation that's simple but refreshing, offering a unique twist on the classic by incorporating fresh vegetables directly into the meatloaf. It's a great way to brighten up the hearty, meaty dish without overwhelming it. The green bell pepper in this version isn't just for flavor, it also adds moisture to the meatloaf, helping to keep it juicy and tender as it bakes. It's a beautiful contrast to the hearty beef with the slight bitterness of the peppers cutting through the richness. This dish embodies the 1950s approach to making meals wholesome and satisfying, incorporating vegetables into the family meal in a subtle but impactful way. To make this bell pepper studded meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for the perfect balance of fat and flavor. In a large mixing bowl, combine the ground beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season generously with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce for a savory depth of flavor. Next, take 1 or 2 medium green bell peppers, remove the seeds, and chop them finely. Mix the peppers into the meat mixture, along with the other ingredients. The bell peppers will not only add flavor, but will also help keep the meatloaf moist and tender as it bakes. Be sure to mix gently so that the peppers are evenly distributed throughout the meat. Once the mixture is combined, shape it into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. If you'd like, you can top the meatloaf with a bit of ketchup or tomato sauce for a sweet, tangy glaze that adds even more flavor. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes or until the meatloaf is golden and cooked through. When you slice into this meatloaf, you'll find a tender, flavorful interior filled with the fresh taste of bell peppers, adding a burst of color and flavor to each bite. Serve it with mashed potatoes, rice, or a side of roasted vegetables for a complete meal. Meatloaf with green bell peppers is a great way to incorporate vegetables into a comforting dish that everyone will enjoy, giving a fresh twist to the classic family favorite. Meatloaf with apple and sage. In the 1950s, apples were often seen as a sweet addition to savory dishes, a trend that blended the classic American love for fruit with hearty, everyday meals. Meatloaf with apple and sage is a perfect example of how flavors from different culinary traditions came together in mid-century American kitchens. The sweetness of apples and the earthiness of sage create a surprisingly delicious contrast with the savory beef, turning a humble meatloaf into a flavorful, aromatic dish. This combination brings out the best in both the apples and the meat, creating a comforting and unforgettable meal. The apples provide a subtle sweetness and a hint of tartness, while the sage adds a fragrant, herby depth that pairs wonderfully with the richness of the beef. The texture of the apples contrasts with the dense meat, keeping each bite moist and flavorful. This variation on the traditional meatloaf is perfect for those who appreciate the balance of sweet and savory, giving an unexpected twist to an old classic. To make this delicious meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for a nice balance of flavor and juiciness. In a large bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a teaspoon of dried sage to bring out the herbaceous flavors. For the apple, choose a variety like Granny Smith or Fuji. Both offer a good balance of sweetness and tartness. Peel, core, and finely chop 1 medium apple, then mix it into the meat mixture. The apple will not only add a fresh, fruity flavor, but also help keep the meatloaf moist. Sage complements the apples beautifully, bringing a warm, aromatic layer to the dish. Once everything is mixed together, shape the meat mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For an extra touch of sweetness and flavor, you can drizzle the meatloaf with a little bit of maple syrup or honey before baking. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until the meatloaf is golden brown on top and fully cooked through. When you slice into the meatloaf, the apples will be soft and subtly sweet, balancing the savory, rich beef with their freshness. Serve this meatloaf with roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, or a crisp salad to round out the meal. Meatloaf with apple and sage is a perfect example of how 1950s cooks weren't afraid to experiment with flavors, blending the familiar with the unexpected to create something truly memorable. It's a timeless dish that brings comfort and a little surprise to every bite. Meatloaf with zucchini and parmesan. In the 1950s, home cooks were always looking for ways to make meals more nutritious and creative without straying too far from tradition. Enter the addition of zucchini and parmesan to meatloaf, a fresh twist on a classic dish that brought a bit of summer's bounty into the heart of winter meals. The mild, tender zucchini provides moisture, while the salty, nutty Parmesan cheese adds depth and richness to the meatloaf. Together, they create a balanced, satisfying meal that feels both comforting and light, a perfect blend of hearty and healthy. Zucchini, often used in 1950s kitchens for its versatility, is the unsung hero in this dish. As it cooks, the zucchini softens and releases moisture, ensuring that the meatloaf stays juicy. The Parmesan, meanwhile, adds a savory, slightly tangy flavor that complements the beef beautifully, elevating the dish from simple to special. This variation on the traditional meatloaf combines the freshness of vegetables with the richness of cheese, making it a dish that's both flavorful and comforting, but with a little extra depth. To make this zucchini and Parmesan meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for its balance of fat and flavor. In a large bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a teaspoon of dried Italian seasoning to bring out the flavors. Grate 1 medium zucchini and squeeze out any excess moisture using a clean towel or cheesecloth. This will prevent the meatloaf from becoming too watery. Add the grated zucchini to the meat mixture along with half a cup of grated Parmesan cheese. The zucchini will blend seamlessly with the beef, while the Parmesan adds a wonderful savory depth. Gently mix the ingredients together until well combined, then shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For an extra touch, sprinkle a bit more Parmesan over the top of the meatloaf before baking, allowing it to crisp up and form a golden, cheesy crust. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until the meatloaf is cooked through and the top is golden and slightly crispy. Once baked, slice into the meatloaf to reveal a moist, flavorful interior dotted with bits of tender zucchini and complemented by the rich, nutty Parmesan. Serve this zesty meatloaf with a side of roasted vegetables, a simple salad, or mashed potatoes to complete the meal. Meatloaf with zucchini and Parmesan is a fresh take on a classic dish, offering a delightful mix of textures and flavors that make it a standout on the dinner table. It's a great way to sneak some vegetables into your meal while still enjoying all the comforting flavors of traditional meatloaf. Meatloaf with sweet corn. Sweet corn has long been a beloved ingredient in American kitchens, especially in the 1950s when it was often used in dishes that were hearty, comforting, and a little bit sweet. Meatloaf with sweet corn is a variation that combines the savory richness of beef with the natural sweetness and pop of corn kernels. This dish is simple, yet full of flavor, offering a satisfying balance between the meat and the sweet corn, all while keeping the texture light and juicy. It's the perfect option for a cozy family dinner that both kids and adults will love. The sweet corn in this meatloaf does more than just add flavor. It helps to keep the loaf moist, while adding bursts of sweetness in every bite. It's a subtle yet delightful way to bring a little summer flavor into the heart of a classic comfort food. This version of meatloaf is easy to make and shows how simple ingredients can come together to create something truly special. To make this meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for the best balance of juiciness and flavor. In a large mixing bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce. Next, add about a cup of canned or frozen sweet corn, making sure it's drained well if using canned. The corn will add both sweetness and texture, making the meatloaf extra juicy. Once the ingredients are combined, gently shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For a little extra flavor, you can top the meatloaf with a thin layer of ketchup or BBQ sauce before baking. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until the meatloaf is golden brown on top and fully cooked through. The result is a deliciously moist meatloaf with sweet bursts of corn, making each bite a comforting combination of savory and sweet. Serve with mashed potatoes or a side of green beans to round out the meal. Meatloaf with sweet corn is a perfect example of how the 1950s took simple, wholesome ingredients and turned them into a meal that brings warmth and joy to the table. Meatloaf with red pepper and garlic. If there's one ingredient that can instantly add a burst of flavor to any dish, it's garlic. Combine that with the sweet, slightly smoky taste of red bell peppers, and you have a meatloaf that's packed with depth and brightness. In the 1950s, cooks loved incorporating fresh vegetables into their meatloaf, and this red pepper and garlic version is a great example. The garlic adds a fragrant, savory element, while the red pepper provides a touch of sweetness and color. Together, they transform the classic meatloaf into something fresh, flavorful, and exciting. The beauty of this dish is its simplicity. The red peppers soften as the meatloaf bakes, infusing the meat with a subtle sweetness, while the garlic gives the loaf a savory kick without overpowering the other ingredients. This variation is perfect for those who enjoy a bit of extra flavor in their meatloaf, but still want to keep it grounded in tradition. To start, use 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for its juiciness and flavor. In a large bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce for added depth. Next, dice 1 red bell pepper and mince 2 cloves of garlic. Stir the red pepper and garlic into the meat mixture, making sure they are evenly distributed throughout the loaf. The red pepper will add color and sweetness, while the garlic will provide a rich, aromatic depth. Once everything is mixed, shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For a little extra flavor, you can top the meatloaf with a thin layer of ketchup or tomato sauce before baking. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until the meatloaf is golden brown on top and fully cooked through. When you slice into this meatloaf, you'll find a moist interior with bits of sweet red pepper and aromatic garlic throughout. Serve this with mashed potatoes, rice, or a crisp salad to complete the meal. Meatloaf with red pepper and garlic is a simple yet flavorful twist on the classic, offering the perfect balance of savory, sweet, and aromatic notes in every bite. Meatloaf with mushrooms and thyme. Mushrooms and thyme are a timeless combination that adds both earthiness and depth to any dish, and this meatloaf is no exception. In the 1950s, mushrooms were beginning to gain popularity, and adding them to meatloaf not only elevated the flavor, but also introduced a subtle richness that perfectly complemented the beef. The fresh, herbaceous notes of thyme balance out the savory mushrooms, creating a meatloaf that's both hearty and flavorful. This version offers a comforting, aromatic twist on the classic, making it a perfect dish for cozy family dinners. The mushrooms bring a deep umami flavor that enhances the beef, while the thyme adds an aromatic, slightly woodsy element that makes each bite a little more sophisticated. It's a simple way to take a familiar dish and give it a fresh, elevated feel. To make this meatloaf, start with 1 pound of ground beef, preferably 80-20 for the best flavor and moisture. In a large bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce to enhance the savory flavors. Next, take 1 cup of fresh mushrooms, either cremini or button mushrooms, and chop them finely. Sauté the mushrooms in a little butter or olive oil until they release their moisture and become tender. Stir in about a teaspoon of fresh thyme, or dried thyme if that's what you have, and let the mixture cool slightly before adding it to the meat mixture. Once the mushrooms and thyme are incorporated, shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For extra flavor, you can top the meatloaf with a bit of ketchup or a light glaze of brown gravy. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until it's golden and fully cooked through. When you slice into this meatloaf, you'll discover a tender, moist interior with earthy mushrooms and fragrant thyme in every bite. Serve with mashed potatoes or roasted vegetables for the perfect meal. Meatloaf with mushrooms and thyme is a great way to bring a little extra flavor to your table while staying true to the comforting roots of the classic dish. Meatloaf with lemon and dill. For a fresh twist on the classic meatloaf, this 1950s recipe combines the bright, zesty flavor of lemon with the herbaceous notes of dill. It's an unexpected but delightful combination that cuts through the richness of the beef, adding a refreshing contrast that lifts the dish. The lemon brings a subtle tang, while the dill offers an aromatic, slightly grassy flavor that complements the meat perfectly. This variation is perfect for those looking for a lighter, more vibrant version of the beloved comfort food. To make this dish, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for the right texture and flavor. In a large bowl, mix the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce for depth. Next, zest 1 lemon and stir it into the meat mixture, along with about a teaspoon of fresh dill, or dried dill if that's what you have. For an extra touch of citrus flavor, you can add a little lemon juice, but be careful not to add too much, as the flavor can overwhelm the meat. Once everything is mixed, shape the meat into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes or until fully cooked and golden brown on top. For a burst of extra flavor, you can garnish the meatloaf with a sprinkle of fresh dill and lemon wedges before serving. This lemon and dill meatloaf is a refreshing twist on the classic, adding a light, aromatic flavor that feels perfect for a cozy dinner. Serve with mashed potatoes, a fresh salad, or roasted vegetables for a complete meal. Meatloaf with sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes add a subtle sweetness and richness to the classic meatloaf, transforming it into a hearty and comforting dish. This 1950s variation combines the natural sweetness of sweet potatoes with the savory beef, creating a perfectly balanced meal. The mashed sweet potatoes not only make the meatloaf moist, but also provide a delightful contrast to the savory meat. To make this dish, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20. In a large bowl, mix the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a bit of Worcestershire sauce. Next, mash 1 medium sweet potato and mix it into the meat mixture for added moisture and sweetness. Shape the mixture into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes, or until fully cooked. The result is a moist, flavorful meatloaf with the earthy sweetness of sweet potatoes in every bite. This dish pairs wonderfully with mashed potatoes or roasted vegetables for a comforting, filling meal. Meatloaf with cranberry sauce. Cranberry sauce isn't just for Thanksgiving, it's a perfect complement to meatloaf, adding a burst of sweetness and tang. This 1950s variation blends the rich, savory meat with the bright, tart flavor of cranberries, creating a delightful contrast that elevates the dish. The cranberry sauce adds moisture to the meatloaf, while also infusing it with a refreshing, slightly sweet twist. To make this dish, start with 1 pound of ground beef, ideally 80-20 for optimal flavor and moisture. In a bowl, combine the beef with 1 cup of breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and finely chopped onion. Season with salt, pepper, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce. Once the meat mixture is ready, shape it into a loaf and place it in a greased baking dish. For the topping, spread a generous layer of cranberry sauce over the top of the meatloaf, letting it bake into the surface. Bake at 350 degrees for about 60 minutes until cooked through. The result is a flavorful, moist meatloaf with a sweet, tangy cranberry glaze that perfectly complements the savory beef. Serve with mashed potatoes or green beans for a delightful meal. Meatloaf with bacon and onion gravy. This 1950s meatloaf combines the savory goodness of ground beef with crispy bacon and is topped with a rich, homemade onion gravy. The bacon adds a smoky depth, while the onion gravy enhances the flavor, making the meatloaf juicy and comforting. To make it, mix ground beef, breadcrumbs, egg, onion, and crumbled bacon. Then, bake at 350 degrees for 60 minutes. For the gravy, sauté onions, then create a roux with flour and beef broth. Pour the gravy over the meatloaf for a hearty, indulgent dish. Meatloaf with maple syrup and mustard. This 1950s-inspired meatloaf features a sweet and tangy glaze made with maple syrup and mustard, offering a delicious balance of flavors. To make it, mix ground beef with breadcrumbs, egg, onion, and seasoning, then shape it into a loaf. For the glaze, combine maple syrup and mustard, then pour over the meatloaf before baking at 350 degrees for 60 minutes. The result is a moist, flavorful meatloaf with a sweet, zesty crust that's perfect for any dinner table. And there you have it, 30 timeless meatloaf variations that bring a little nostalgia and a lot of flavor to the table. Whether you're sticking to tradition or trying something new, these recipes are sure to make your next family dinner extra special. Thanks for joining us, and happy cooking!